Back for another week, another tri-generational conversation here in the Limitless Leadership Lounge. I'm John Gehring, joined as always by Coach Jim Johnson, who's brought along another coach today to step in and give us some great leadership insight here from his experience. So, Coach, without further ado, why don't you introduce our guest and let's get going today?
Yeah, I'm really excited to have Matt Doherty. Actually, Matt's just a little bit younger than me. And actually, we were talking before the show that he got an opportunity to win a state high school championship in New York in my hometown of Rochester at our arena downtown. So that was pretty neat. And then, of course, I followed his career just being a little bit older than him when he went to North Carolina and then his college coaching career. So let me just share a little bit about Matt. Matt Doherty is a nationally recognized motivational speaker, best-selling author, and media personality. He guides corporations, C-suite managers, sales executives, and business and sports coaches to develop their leadership skills and team dynamics. Since being a part of the 1982 national championship team with Michael Jordan at UNC, his journey has included head coach at Notre Dame, UNC Tar Heels, ACC regular season championship, AP National Coach of the Year in 2001, also the head coach at FAU and SMU, in addition working with ESPN, the Indiana Pacers, and the Atlantic 10 Conference. Coach Doherty is committed to sharing his universal teachings and actionable ideas that will work for anybody. Now, without any further ado, let's welcome Matt Doherty to the Limitless Leadership Lounge.
Hey, thank you, Coach. As you were talking about my bio, as you were mentioning my bio, I could hardly keep up with all the schools I coached at as a head coach. And, the things that you kindly did not add is that I got fired from two of those four jobs as a head coach. But I like to claim that I was a foundational coach. And part of that is joking, but part of that is serious. I took over at Notre Dame. That was my first head coaching job. I left after a year. And then I think the year after, 2 years after, Mike Brey went to the Sweet 16 with that team. I took over at North Carolina. I was kind of looking back an interim coach and was help rebuild it and add talent. And 2 years after I left, they won a national championship with the starting five that my staff and I recruited. I took over at FAU, and FAU was like really a bad program. And I didn't have anything to do with Dusty May's success going to the Final Four, but it's kind of fun to see them grow. And then I was at SMU, and 2 years later, Larry Brown takes them to the NCAA tournament. And so, yeah, I've got to enjoy other people's success after my time at those universities. But I do think that if I was good at one thing, it was instilling systems and culture in programs and laying a foundation, hopefully, of success.
Yeah, it's a great point. And before I delve into my first question, it's interesting because I was a head coach at four different high schools. And the first one, I led that team to 18 consecutive losses, and they did not renew my contract. So I felt a little bit of your pain there.
Yeah.
But I learned from it and, ended up having a pretty nice career. So I appreciate what you're sharing. So, well, I can't help. We want to delve a lot into your leadership, but I got to ask you this to start. You played with the legendary Michael Jordan. I'm curious, what did you learn from him?
Well, let's set the record straight, Coach. He played with me, and if you uh, can, I wrote a book called Rebound from Pain to Passion, and he wrote the forward in it, and he talked about what he learned from me, and I really was humbled by that. But the thing about Michael that I always talk about is his energy. I think that people underestimate the value of energy. And it really came to a head for me, I guess, when I was working for the Pacers. I worked for Larry Brown and Donnie Walsh and Kevin Pritchard of the Pacers in their scouting department. And I used to go visit with Donnie Walsh, who was a legendary president, general manager in the NBA from the Bronx and played at North Carolina. and I'd sit with him before games when I was in town. And I remember one time he was sitting there and he had this, strong New York City accent. And I don't think he smoked, but it sounded like he smoked a pack of Camels a day. And he leaned over to me and he said, Matty, the most important thing in the NBA. And he paused, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm getting ready to receive the golden keys to the NBA. And then he said, the most important thing in the NBA, in a player and a team, is energy. And I'm like, what? Energy? And they play 82 games. And if you're a good team, you play 100. And you're playing 3 games a week. And you travel and you're tired and you're nicked up. And when I thought about that, um, I thought about Michael Jordan, because Michael was gifted with great energy. And he's a guy that's legendary stories in the NBA. He could play 36 holes of golf and then score 60 points on Dennis Johnson, the Celtics, in a playoff game. And he could stay out till 5 in the morning in Atlantic City and drop 50 points on the Knicks the next night. Like, he had boundless energy. And some of that you can um, create, but some of it's just a gift.
Mm, yeah. And bouncing back from setbacks like you talked about. And nowadays, I mean, coaches are being fired left and right. The Carolina Panthers give their guy 10 games and then he's out, right? It's kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, it's got to be hard on those coaches to experience that failure and then bounce back with that same vigor and that same energy. How are you able to do that and turn your career into a success despite those obstacles?
Yeah, I think one thing that I really try to teach now as an executive coach, and I work with small to mid-sized business owners, and one of the platforms I work through is Vistage, which is one of the oldest executive coaching organizations in the country. So I'm a chair in the Charlotte market, and I'll have, uh, relatively young men and women, in their 50s looking to retire. They sell their company, or they um, delegate the position of CEO to somebody else, and they go into a board of directors role. And I really focus on their purpose. What is your purpose? Why did God put you on this earth? What were you genetically encoded to do? And for me and Coach Johnson, we're wired to coach. We're wired to teach. And he's doing that through this podcast and his books and his lectures, as I am doing as well. I am a teacher and a coach. And so if you can align your purpose with and work through a business, your job, and it doesn't matter what industry, I can always be a teacher and a coach in that industry. And same thing with coach. So once you realize what your purpose is, then it's not really work. You know, you you know you walk by a gym and you hear the squeaking shoes and a bouncing ball. You want to go in there and help a kid with his jump shot. That's just built into Coach Johnson and I. And so now I'm doing that as an executive coach. I get the same fulfillment working with business executives, and we do peer advisory. So we'll bring a group together of 15 to 20 people once a month. And when that's over, I feel like I just coached a game. It's just nobody was watching. It's very fulfilling work. So once you find your purpose and you can kind of align that with your job, then it's not so much bouncing back. It's just a continuum of what you do. It's what we do, and there are bumps in the road. So, and especially in college and pro sports.
Yeah, well said. I'm real big. I do a lot of leadership presentations like you do, Matt, and I always talk about developing your own and creating your own personal mission statement. And that changed my life dramatically as a person and as a leader when I got clarity of that and really trying to live it each day. So well said. I do got to ask you because you played for the late great Dean Smith. So tell us two or three leadership lessons you learned from the great Dean Smith.
I probably refer to Coach Smith now more than I did before as a coach, as a basketball coach. Um, I talk a lot about I call it the organizational triangle. Every organization is made up of talent at the top, systems and culture at the bottom. And the better your systems, the better your culture, the better your talent will perform, the better your talent you'll retain, the better talent you attract. Well, Dean Smith had great systems. You know, he had the motion offense, he had the secondary break, he had the multiple defenses, he had the four corners, he had, the way we watch film, the way they graded film. Um, but you could have great systems and great talent, which he did. But if you don't have good culture, nothing else matters. And I say that culture is king. And one thing as I became an executive coach, I took good culture for granted because I was blessed, Coach Johnson and John. I won a CYO championship in eighth grade with Mr. Coleman. All right. Gene Larkin was our point guard. Gene played for the Minnesota Twins. Um, High school, I played for Bob McKillop, was my high school coach my first 2 years. And then I had Dick Zeitler, who played basketball at Georgetown my last 2 years, and we won a state championship in Rochester at the War Memorial Coliseum. Then I go play it for Dean Smith at North Carolina. I've been around good culture. Like my parents, we had good culture in our home. At St. Raphael's Grammar School, I had good culture. Like, so it's kind of what I expected. So when I experienced bad culture, it's like, oh my gosh. So it was really hard for me to explain what drove a good culture. And then when I got into executive coaching, there's a book that I encourage every one of my clients to read. It's called Culture by Design by David Friedman. And it really spelled out how you drive a good culture intentionally. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about Dean Smith, because to me, it starts with your vision. Where do you want to go as a program? To your core values. What are your core values? And in a lot of speaking engagements, when I talk about culture, and I'll ask people in the audience to raise their hand if they have core values, and pretty much everyone raises their hand, and then I'll ask, like, okay, John, you had your hand up. What are your core values? And they go, they don't know them. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So Dean Smith and you as a coach, Coach Johnson, probably have heard this before. His are play hard, play smart, play together. Everybody knew them. The fans, the players, the secretaries, everyone knew that was the core values. But now you have to define, what does play hard look like? Okay. So to me, as a high school kid, playing hard might just mean, oh, I block a shot, or I sprint the floor hard one out of every four times. So he defines playing hard, sprinting the floor, drawing charges, first to the loose ball, diving on the floor, sprinting to the timeouts. So now, okay, we've got that. Those are the defined behaviors that are rooted in the core values. And then the hardest part for any leader is holding people accountable. Will you hold people accountable? And most people don't. That's where they fall short. So I tell a story. Michael Jordan, well, let's just say his senior year, his last year, his third year, which was his last year, my senior year. We're playing in Madison Square Garden against St. John's, and there's a lot of traffic. Michael shows up to pregame meal 3 minutes late. Coach Smith doesn't start him, holds him out for 3 minutes, and then puts him in the game. He did that to the preseason player of the year, an All-American, who ended up being the best player in the world of all time. Are you willing to do that to your best player? Because your culture is what you allow. And Coach Smith wasn't going to allow people being late.
Wow.
I add to that, Matt. I had my last year. My best player actually ended up playing a couple years in the NBA, but he went to the University of Vermont, so he wasn't expected to be an NBA player, but he overachieved. But his sophomore year, we were playing in the sectional semifinals, And we always had free throws in the mornings on days of games, and you had to be there by 7 a.m. And if you came late, I didn't care who you were, you didn't start. And it was funny because as a sophomore, he was still our best player. And my
Yeah.
seniors came to me during the day and said, Anthony's going to start. I said, no, he's not. And he did not start. The funny thing is, the kid I put in for him, Anthony was 6'6", 230. The kid I put in for him was 6'2", 180, and he scored our first two baskets. So he made me look like a genius.
But it usually works out like that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Karma.
absolutely.
And culture is, of course, big in any athletics, but also in the business world, and that's a transition that you've made, Matt. So, what kinds of similarities and differences are there? Were you expecting when you made this pivot into executive coaching? Were you expecting to be as much overlap as there is, or are there some overlaps that you're surprised that it actually translates from basketball coaching to executive coaching?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I knew there was overlap, but I didn't realize how much. And I'd say if I had to put a number on it, 90%. I probably thought 50. It's the finance part, the budgeting, the finance, the selling of a company. But I mentioned the organizational triangle, talent, systems, and culture. Every organization, I don't care if it's a church, a school, your home, is made up of talent, your family members, systems. Okay, how do we how do we make breakfast in the morning? How do we how do I grew up uh, five kids and two parents in a house with two bathrooms, one upstairs, and how do you organize the ins and outs of going through to take a shower in the morning? And so what's your system, and then what's your culture? Are you getting along, or you're not getting along? You're helpful to your siblings, or you're not? So every organization is made up of talent, systems, and culture, just like a basketball team, just like a business. And so, what are your systems? And I encourage every business owner to read the book Traction, which is a systems book. How do you meet? What's your organization, accountability chart look like? What are your, standard operating procedures? And then the culture piece we already talked about. So there is a lot of carryover. And this sounds self-serving, but when I work with clients that have played a team sport at least the high school level, they get it. Like they get it a lot quicker than somebody who didn't. And again, it comes down to me, defining the behaviors, showing up on time, no typos, meeting deadlines, and holding people accountable. People that have played a sport have been held accountable, and have their weaknesses have been brought up in a film session, and they don't get butthurt over a comment of a coaching comment, as opposed to someone getting their feelings hurt because you pointed out that, hey, John, you were late for the meeting. I don't appreciate that. And, then you get your feelings hurt because, well, my dog threw up and all these excuses. I'm like, no, there's no excuses, creating a culture of accountability is so important, because if you don't, you can't gain traction, and that's the book I was referring to.
Mhm. Yeah, well said. Hey, Matt, I got to delve in because outside looking in, and maybe I'm wrong, but I would think when you became the head coach of North Carolina, that had to be your dream job coaching because you played there and played on a national championship team. But as a young leader, when you take over something that you're really excited about and it doesn't work out like you think it would, tell us about what you learned from that
Yeah.
experience and how you could advise young leaders when they take over something they're excited about, but it doesn't work out so well.
Yeah, no, I think the neat thing about having played and coached is, Coach Johnson, what do you do after a game? What do you do after every game? You watch the film.
Right.
Watch
Analyze.
the
Yep.
film. You debrief the game like they do in
Yeah.
the military.
Right.
You do a SWOT analysis, right? What are your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats? What went well, what would you do differently? And so a friend of mine suggested I go on a leadership journey and take a class at the Darden School in Virginia and work with a lady named Carol Weber, who's an executive coach. And so I did it. He said, listen, take the year off, study leadership, and you'll come back better than ever. And so I ended up taking 2 years off and went to the Darden School, Wharton, and I just took executive classes, in the MBA programs, a week-long class. And then I started working with a lady named Fran Johnston, who taught a class on emotional intelligence at Wharton. So I'm 40 at the time, give or take, maybe 42. And this is 2003, so I was 41. It was the first time I ever heard of emotional intelligence.
Mm.
And I remember sitting in the class, and after the class, I went up to her and introduced myself, and she was aware of who I was because, she followed sports and, I just got fired at the University of North Carolina, national news at the time. And she agreed to be my executive coach. So I'd fly up from Charlotte to Philadelphia once a month on my own dime, fly up in the morning, meet with her, fly home in the evening, because I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn. I wanted to get better. And that was the number one goal of all the teams I've coached. Get better today. All right. Number 2, win your next game. Number 3, win the league. Number 4, win the conference tournament. Number 5, win the national championship. But you can't do number 5 if you don't do number 1. And so I wanted to get better every day. And she told me, and I never heard this term at the time, she says, you're a lifelong learner. And I didn't know I never heard that before. But I realized it's a compliment. I like to learn. I'm curious. I ask questions. And so the more I learned about leadership, the more passionate I became. And I realized, wow, I wish I would have taken these classes before I was a head coach, because maybe I'd still be the head coach, because my blind spot was emotional intelligence. I thought everyone should think like I thought.
Right.
And that's emotional intelligence. They call it EQ, which is
Right.
equally, if not more important than IQ. And that's something that I think over the past several decades has changed. At least our perspective of it has changed. And that's something that maybe growing up, Matt, I'm not sure if that's something that you ever really put a lot of effort into developing. Now, how would you recommend that a young emerging leader spend some intentional time to improve their EQ, not just their IQ?
Yeah. In the book I wrote called Rebound from Pain to Passion, I talk about the 6 no's, KNOWS, of leadership. And I make up a story about this 7-footer from Eastern Europe I try to recruit. His name was Stevit, Stevit. So coaches, we all love acronyms, right? We all, we're teachers. And so how do you remember? You tell a story, you have an acronym. So Stevit, the S stands for self, the T stands for team, the E stands for environment, the V stands for vision, the I stands for industry, the second T stands for truth. The most important thing a leader can do is understand, know themselves, know yourself. So how do you do that? Well, you take assessments. I'm an assessment junkie. I love DISC, Myers-Briggs, um, culture index, predictive index. The better, but I really lean on DISC because it's probably the easiest one to understand, because it just has the DISC, and that's an acronym. It stands for basically initialism, I guess it's called, but the D is for driver, I for influencer, S for steady, C for basically uh, I'm drawing a blank on that one, but
Is it connector or
um,
contributor?
no. I'll think of it in a second.
Okay.
But so it's a little easier for me to teach, and I think for people to grasp. Um, um, so when I teach that and coach that, when people realize not everybody is like them. So when I worked with Carol Weber at UVA, she had me do the Myers-Briggs um, assessment. And she told me that only 2%, I was an ENTJ, okay? And I jokingly said, I've been called a lot of four-letter words before, not an ENTJ. And so she explained that only 2% of the population were ENTJs. And as she said that, I'm thinking, oh gosh, this is only a few months after I got let go at North Carolina. I'm thinking, I'm elite. Only 2%? Like North Carolina fired an elite coach. And she kind of sensed what I was feeling. And she said, no, you don't get it. She said, that means 98% of the population doesn't think like you think.
Mm.
I was like, oh my gosh. That was very created an awareness. I had no idea. And so the DISC assessment, the D's are like 4% of the population. I'm a DI, driver influencer. S's, steady state. It's like 69% of the population start with an S. They don't like change. They don't like being called out. They don't even like being called out to receive an award in front of people.
Mm.
But they lead from behind. Like everybody can lead. So the S's lead from behind. The D's, lead from the front. The I's lead from the middle, and the C's lead from the side. The C stands for basically conscientious. So they want all the data. They want all the information before they make a decision. So I like to go fast, and I use the analogy of I drive a speedboat on the lake, and I'm going 70 miles an hour, and my team is in back, and they're falling out into the wake, drowning. And I'm looking back and like, you should have held on tighter, you know? And instead of going slower to make sure no one falls out and making sure they have life preservers on, or make sure that and so I like to go fast. And so I think that looking back, I would have been so much better as a coach, understanding myself better. Then the T, understanding the team. So, here we have, Jim, John, myself, and, Jim might be a D. So Jim likes information. Like, if you're going to send me an email, 2 sentences, 3 bullet points. Anything more than that, I'm not going to read it. Now, John, you might be, the I, and you might be more friendly, personable. You like at the beginning of a conversation, like to talk, about the weather and what you did last night. To me, that's a waste of time. Let's move on. But I've got to know, like the platinum rule, the golden rule is treat people like you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat others how they want to be treated. So if I want to emotionally connect with you, and I know that you're an I'm going to have some fluff at the beginning of the conversation because I want to connect with your heart, not only your mind, but your heart. And I think great leaders do that.
Great point.
As much as it might pain you, right, to actually go, treat others the way they want to be treated. I think that's another effective tactic in sales too. And actually last week we had a sales expert on who talked about those communication tactics. And I know that while you aren't necessarily in sales, a lot of what you did in your career with recruiting and now with executive coaching, there are sales like tactics that you have to use. Talk a little bit about.
I've been in sales my whole career.
Yeah.
I the best salesmen in the country are college assistant coaches because they get sales. I speak on sales a lot. And if salesmen in the business world had the passion and drive and the creativity of salesmen in the college assistant coaching world, they all would be millionaires because we are on it 24 hours a day. We wake up thinking about recruiting. We go to bed thinking about recruiting. Um, you know, we are very creative as assistant basketball coaches. Um, and I was a salesman. I sold bonds on Wall Street for 4 years. I hated it, so I wasn't a good salesman. But then I became a college basketball coach for 22 years, and I sold. You're selling all the time. You're selling to recruits. You're selling to the team that you can beat an opponent. Like we can go into Duke and beat them. I've got to sell that to the team. I got to sell them on our strategy, especially if we make a change in strategy. This is why we're doing this. So I've got to get buy-in from the leadership of the team and then sell it to the rest of the team is why we are making this change against this opponent. And then I got to sell to my athletic director. I got to sell to the boosters. We're always selling.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, Matt, delving back into your book, I'd be curious, can you dive into one or two? You mentioned the 6 no's of leadership, KNOWS. Can you dive into one or two and share a little bit more about those?
Yeah, well, I think the most important one is knowing yourself, but to know yourself, you got to know the truth. You got to mine for the truth. So to me, the most important ones are know yourself, know your team, know the truth. And to know yourself and know the truth, know your team, you got to know the truth. So how do you know the truth? How do you create an environment of mining for the truth? So if I had to do it over again as a coach, I would have my lead assistant instead of, associate head coach. It would the title would be truth teller. So I want them to be able to come to me whenever they feel like, in front of my staff or in private, in a respectful manner, but to tell me, hey, coach, I think you're wrong, or I think you shouldn't have said that to that player in that meeting, or you need to change here, you need to do this differently. And then I have to condition myself to accept it because as a DI, I want to go after his throat, right? And so I've got to be able to sit back, take a deep breath, and thank him.
Mm.
Thank you for telling me the truth. Now, I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to act on it, but I've got to create an environment where the truth bubbles up in a safe zone. And because if you don't manage the truth will manage you right out the door.
Mm.
And so I'd rather get the truth first so I could ride it like a wave as opposed to being on the shore and getting crushed by the wave. And so I look back going, back to my biggest strength is I'm intense, I'm driven, I'm competitive. My biggest weakness, I'm intense, I'm driven, I'm competitive, right? So your biggest strength's your biggest weakness. And so when I was going, I delegated to my staff certain things, and one would be overseeing academics. He would report to the academic, or the academic advisor would report to him, on the progress of our players and who needed to be in study hall, who needed tutoring, you know. And so I'd go, I'm 6'7", and I'm intense, and I can be, loud, and I have my checklist. Okay, I got to talk to this assistant about academics, this one about summer camp. I got to talk to this one about recruiting, this one. And so I'd go into this assistant's office. His name was Bob, and I'm 6'7", and I'd stand up, and I'd stand basically over the desk. I say, Bob, Joe's doing well in school, right? And Bob would say, yeah, coach. Yeah. Joe's doing well in school. I'm like, good, because we'll need him next semester. He's our best player. And I'd walk out of the room and I'd check, checked on academics. I'm good there. Well, then all of a sudden Joe would be struggling. You're like, whoa, Bob, you told me he was doing well. Well, when I left that meeting, Bob and the other assistants huddled up and said, man, coach came in asking about Joe's grades, and I couldn't tell him the truth. Joe's struggling, but if I told coach he's struggling, I felt like he'd bite my head off. Right? So if I were doing that today, a couple things. One, a leader needs to delegate so he has enough white space on his calendar, meaning not stacked with appointments, that he could be present and take his time talking to Bob about Joe's academics, and maybe I'd say, "Hey, Bob, let's go for a walk." Now we go for a walk, we're outside, and I give him an opportunity to tell me the truth by setting the stage of, "Hey, Bob, I got to imagine Joe's struggling in school. You know, he wasn't a great student in high school. We were fortunate to get him in. I got to imagine he's really struggling. Well, what can you give me an update?" Now I made it okay for him to tell me the truth.
Great point.
That's leadership. And I sucked at that.
Mm.
I'd
That's
be
a
a
great
lot better now.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great point because in fact, I wrote a blog about the power of having a great right-hand person, and for me at the high school level was my JV coach, and I was fortunate my last 27 years, I had three great JV coaches that I never called it that, but you're so right. They were truth tellers. They tell me when I did well, and they tell me when I screw up, and they always were sharing suggestions, and that helped immensely. And early in my career, I was like what you were saying, very hard-headed and kind of just wanted to blaze my own path and not worry about anybody else. So, well said. Well, speaking of that, Matt, let's delve in uh, two part. So, as a young leader, you're coming in, and as a basketball coach, I know you a lot of times you did get an opportunity to choose your own staff. So,
Mhm.
tell us how you did that and then the other part of that is your team. What were you looking for to bring in the right people? And I know you talked about talent, which we all know you need talent to
Yeah.
play. But tell us about first your staff, and then about how your thought process in picking the right players for your
Yeah.
culture.
Well, I think that, you know, you need to have a mindset of what if I became a head coach next year? So as an assistant coach at Kansas, I had the opportunity to become a head coach before the Notre Dame job. I'm pretty good at preparing. Like I love to prepare for a game. I love to prepare for practice. And I was preparing to be a head coach. You know, what would I do? I worked for Roy Williams for 7 years, Bob McKillop for 3. You know, what would I take from them and bring to a head coaching position? What would I do differently? So I was always making notes, going to clinics, and then I made a list of potential assistant coaches, and the um, the and some would depend on, was it a national job, regional job, was it a big job, a smaller job? But I had a list, and at the top of that list was Doug Wojcik, who was at the Naval Academy. Doug worked his tail off, so I was big on work ethic and dotting I's and crossing T's. And so as soon as I got the Notre Dame job, I contacted Doug and talked to him during the interview process. "Hey, if I get this, I want you to join me." And then I took my time on the others. There were certain people that I felt comfortable with, and Roy Williams would always say, if you want to hire somebody, and if you don't know them, you know somebody that knows them very well. But once you go beyond that, it gets watered down because it's so intimate, so intense that you really want to know who you're working with. And the loyalty, the work ethic are paramount to me. Character is paramount to me. Now, Larry Brown once said to me, I was at SMU, ironically, and he was recommending someone to me. And I said, "Coach, I appreciate it, but I just don't know him." And he said, it's almost like he confessed. He's like, "You're right." He said, you can teach somebody to guard the pick and roll, but you can't teach them to love you."
Mm.
Mm.
I thought that was pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And so the loyalty factor and the work ethic are the character. Are they going to do the right thing?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, hey, Matt, you also talk a lot in your book about rebound from pain to passion. I know you mentioned some of this earlier, but you talk about how much leadership is a learned behavior.
Yes.
And that's so important to young and emerging leaders who think they may either have leadership or they don't. How do we as a culture reframe our mindset into realizing that leadership is something that we can learn rather
Yes.
than something you're either a born leader or you're not?
Yeah, no, I tell you what, after I lost my job at North Carolina '03, I was, depressed. A lot of things were written about me and my leadership style, and people, some people were saying I wasn't a good leader. And so I was of that school that you're born a leader or you're not. And so I was really struggling. And when I went to um, take this class at Wharton with Fran Johnson teaching his class on emotional intelligence in the book Primal Leadership, The Art of Emotional Intelligence, I think it's called, by Daniel Goleman, I think there's a line in there that said leadership is a learned behavior. And it was the most exciting thing I ever read. That sounds goofy, sounds geeky. It is, so what? But it made me realize that I could become a better leader. And so I went on this 2-year leadership journey, and then I took a job at FAU because I wanted to implement the things I learned into a coaching environment again. And, I became better. I'm not perfect, still not perfect. I'll never be perfect, right? The only person that's perfect, they hung on a cross. And so we're flawed. We're human. We'll make mistakes, but you try to get better today. And leadership is a learned behavior. And you don't have to be the DI on the DISC profile. You can be the C, compliant, conscientious. You can be the S. It's just the big thing is you need to augment your skill set. I had the pleasure of interviewing Patrick Lencioni on my podcast, the Rebound Podcast. And here's this guy who writes books like The Working Genius, and he's written a bunch of books. One of the top leadership gurus in the country, and The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. He wrote, very popular book. Well, Patrick said that he's not good at galvanizing his team. And you might think, well, if you're a leader, you've got to galvanize your team. You've got to be out front. You've got to lead the charge and get them fired up. And he said that drained his battery. So he delegated it. He had someone on his team to do it on a regular basis. He said, that doesn't mean I never do it, but when I do it, it's impactful. And so that goes back to the 6 no's of leadership. Number one, you got to know yourself. And he got to know himself. He didn't get to know himself till later in life. Like, this was a recent discovery.
Right.
And so leadership is a journey. It's a practice. I stress this all the time. Like, I never understood until a couple of years ago why doctors call it a medical practice, while lawyers call it a legal practice. I'm like, dude, don't practice on me. Practice on Jim and John, and when you get good, then you could operate on me, right? But you realize it's a skill. Like, cutting someone open is a skill. Law is a skill because you got to practice. You got to practice getting up in front of a jury. You got to practice, laws can change at times. So you have to constantly stay on top of it. Leadership is a practice. And I don't think people use that mindset. Like, the best golfers in the world, Thursday at the Masters, play the first round. They go to the range with their swing coach, and work on their game. They tweak their swing. So as a leader, who is your coach? And are you tweaking your swing? And so that's why I enjoy what I do, because the people that I work with realize that it is a practice and they need a leadership coach.
That's a great point, Matt. And we're getting close to the end, so I just want to say, and I'll have one closing question. And John, I don't know about contact for our listeners, but as far as if you could summarize everything you shared and really zero it down, what would be one thing you would leave our audience with today to help them become a better leader?
Yeah, that's great. I think you got to be curious, have a growth mindset, ask questions, read, listen to podcasts. Like, when you're in your car, I consume books. I love to listen to books. I'm in my car all the time. It's hard for me to actually read a book at night because I'm preparing for my next day. So, but I'm in my car a lot. So I listen to books instead of listening to the radio
Mhm.
or music. I'm listening to Call Sign Chaos right now by General Mattis. And so I'm hopefully listening and checking off 2 books a month. And then, so I think that's the biggest thing. Be curious. Um, go to clinics just like we did as a basketball coach. Well, they're leadership clinics, right? So, go to a clinic, listen to podcasts, listen to books, be curious.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are all things that you talk about in your book, Rebound, which is worth a read as well. You can find it up on Amazon. And I'm curious, Coach, because it's something that is on your reviews and everything. Jay Billis, who's a well-known ESPN commentator, I know him as a commentator, given my age, but I know you probably know him as well for his time with Duke, your ultimate rival, probably the greatest rivalry in sports. Um, Jay calls you a friend. How is that possible?
Well, we're just trying to model the behavior we would like in Congress, reach across the aisle. I was just reaching across the aisle to the other side, and we can work together. Duke and Carolina can work together for a greater good, and so I just wish our government would do the same.
That's
Well
awesome.
said and timely too. So if Jay Billis, if a Duke man can recommend the book, certainly it's saying something. It's Rebound from Pain to Passion. You can find it on Amazon, and I know you can find it elsewhere as well. Matt, the best way to contact you or get in touch with you or your team, if anybody's looking for executive coaching or to find out more about you.
Yeah, thank you very much. They can go to my website, dohertycoaching.com. That's DOHERTY coaching.com.
And that's down in the show notes, as well as a link if you want to pick up the book Rebound from Pain to Passion. Matt, thank you so much for your time today and your insights here on the Limitless Leadership Lounge.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Matt.